So, welcome everyone to episode 2 of anger management. And it's very important if you haven't watched episode 1 to please go and back and watch that first because each episode will build on the previous one. So, the previous episode we looked at anger and what is anger. And I think what I took away from that is that anger is basically it's a secondary emotion and it's used to defend. It's a defensive mechanism, or it's used as a coping mechanism. And I don't think we generally think of anger in that way, but it's a defense mechanism and a coping mechanism. One thing that I just want to add to the previous episode before we continue is that I didn't mention that anger could very possibly also be bloodline related. So it could be an epigenetic marker, and that epigenetic marker is related to iniquity on the bloodline. So let's take a quick example. It could be something like bloodshed, murder, that kind of thing, violence on the bloodline. And so that's something that we also take into consideration when we deal with a client that is struggling with anger. So please go back and watch that episode. So today's episode is all about triggers because anger is something that is triggered by something else. So Natanja is going to start off this episode and she's going to tell us a little bit more about the triggers of anger.
Well, I think it's important to realize that all of us experience anger at some point in our lives. All of us get to a crossroad and you become angry. And I think the problem is that's why, when I thought about this, how many people, that really have anger issues, you'll think, oh, this person needs to go for anger management. And that's the whole point, is we need to learn how to manage our anger in such a way that it doesn't cause harm to us and our relationship. And the only way to do that, the first step in managing your anger is actually understanding where your anger comes from. What is the trigger to your anger? And then to recognize your triggers. Once you've identified them, to see the pattern in your life and to say, okay, this is what is the cause or what activates me to become angry. And then when I'm activated, I do this, this, and this. And so it also has to do with mindfulness. You need to be mindful of your anger problem, and you need to be mindful of how you react once you are triggered. So first of all, we're going to look at a list of things that might trigger us. And these are common things, everyday things that happen to all of us. So the first thing is your expectations that are not being met. Often we want something or we expect something, but we don't voice it. And then when it doesn't happen the way we want it to happen or how we want it to happen, then we become disappointed. And once we are disappointed and our expectations aren't met, we become angry. The next thing is bitterness. Bitterness and anger sort of go hand in hand. The one can trigger the other. Okay, so we just need to be aware of that as well. So holding on to your bitterness or your resentment from a past experience or in the past you've been wronged or hurt, and you hold it against that person, and they do something small in the future, and then you burst out in anger because you haven't dealt with that previous feeling. Also suppressing your emotions. Any places where you don't deal with your emotions, and that happens a lot. Maybe you're at work and you feel if you work on these emotions or process these emotions now, you'll fall apart. Maybe you're not at work. Maybe you were never taught how to process your emotions and how to deal with it. And so we suppress it. And we spoke about it yesterday, and that's when that sort of steam pot explosion happens. Then disappointment is similar, as we said, to being for our expectations to not be met. And it can also trigger a feeling of betrayal. Stress is something that is also, if you are stressed, how many times are you tired, you had a bad day, you've had a horrible day at work, you come home and then you're angry at your spouse or your kids or your parents. Okay, conflict. Conflict is an interpersonal thing that happens, but we should all know that you can be in conflict with yourself as well. If you choose not to have the fight with the person or to sort it out, to deal with whatever it is that created the conflict, the chances are good that you'll have the conflict in your head. And that's what we call overthinkers, right? They think through the conflict in their head, but it's still conflict and it still leads to you being angry at the other person. Resentment links to bitterness, in my opinion, as well. Resentment and bitterness sort of also go hand in hand. And so if you're feeling resentful towards someone because they've caused you pain, they've caused you harm, they're hurting your feelings, then you become angry, and that can also lash out of you. Physical and emotional pain. You know, people who are, I've seen a few clients who have fibromyalgia. They are in constant pain everywhere. And they become angry at everything and everyone. And it's the physical pain and the strain of that physical pain on the body and on the mind that makes them angry. But the same can happen when we are in emotional pain. When we are emotionally hurt and wounded by people, we become angry, again, as a defense mechanism. Feeling threatened or attacked. When we feel threatened or attacked, our natural response may be to become defensive and angry. Feeling frustrated and powerless. Frustration and powerless, in my opinion, is when you then start displaying the same behaviors that was used against you. You spoke about that yesterday. You then become the abuser because you're trying to take back your power. And often because we haven't dealt with those emotions, we do that in anger. We take back our power in anger. Feeling invalidated or treated unfairly. When we feel invalidated, it's when people deny us what we are feeling. So we'll say, well, this made me feel like this, this, and this. And someone will say, you're overreacting. That's not true. It didn't happen like that. And so our experience of how the person treated us is not validated. And that can lead to anger because no one is stepping up to say, I'm sorry that I made you feel this way. And so by recognizing these triggers of anger, and there might be some more, there might be some different ones for those of you who are listening, you might have a few different triggers. These are the most common ones, and they sort of very holistic. They encapsulate a lot of things. But go sit, and if you can break it down into smaller things that trigger you, then do that. Because this is the first step in learning how to manage our responses and prevent negative consequences. And it's important to seek help if you struggle with these things in managing your anger as uncontrolled anger. So that's the important thing. It's okay to have the thought of I'm angry or to have that impulse of anger. The problem comes when you act on it, when you choose to behave in anger or choose to react out of your anger instead of maybe calming down, recognizing the trigger and managing it.
Yes, so for me, the most valuable thing about knowing a trigger, what your trigger is, and being able to identify it is that gives you the power back. Because in that moment of uncontrolled rage or anger, it's like you lose control. And that's where a lot of the shame comes from after such an incident, is looking back and thinking, oh my word, I really messed this up. But if you can identify what triggers your anger, you're taking back control. And this was a big thing for me. When I realized that two things that really, really trigger my anger is feeling unsafe. And that was related to betrayal in the past in relationships. So the moment I feel there's going to be betrayal or there is betrayal, I'm not safe, I'm not protected, it triggers anger. It used to trigger anger in me. So for me, a big thing was safety. And then the other thing is injustice. I get triggered by injustice. And it's not just injustice against myself as a person. When I would see injustice, especially against weaker people, it would trigger anger. And so what I learned was in that moment when I get angry, to stop myself and ask, okay, just take a step back. Why am I angry now? And if I could figure out, I'm feeling unsafe now. I'm scared of betrayal. I'm scared of being hurt. It's kind of like it took away the anger. And it made it easier for me to communicate to that person that upset me instead of screaming and shouting and being upset and saying nasty things like we all do when we're upset. to communicate in a better way. Listen, what you did now makes me feel really unsafe. And this is why it makes me feel unsafe, because in the past, this and this happened. And so then people have a better understanding for what you're going through. So I really want to encourage you, even ask the Holy Spirit to help you and show you what are your triggers. Because the moment you get into that anger response, if you can identify the trigger, it really does give you the control back.
So
So,
I sort of want to explain it, sorry, I want to explain it like this. It's a sailboat. And the moment you understand the trigger, it takes the wind out of the sail. There's nothing that's pushing that anger forward anymore. There's nothing causing it to progress into something more than just a feeling. There's no behavior. And I agree, it does give you back just control of your emotions and understanding that this person is maybe not the cause of what I'm feeling now. They're just triggering it.
yes. And in interpersonal relationships, like for example, a husband and a wife, this was so valuable for me to be able to communicate this to my husband. Because otherwise, he just has this angry wife and he doesn't know what he's doing wrong. And sometimes he may not even be doing something wrong. But if in that moment, instead of being angry, I can explain to him what you said now, what you did now made me feel this way. And this is what happened in my past that makes me feel like this. It's also not an accusation game that you play. If you can explain your trigger to the person that's triggered you, and what can happen is there's growth in that relationship. Because if a person now knows that is something that is painful, next time they may communicate differently or act differently, because they know, I don't want you to feel unsafe. I don't want you to feel there's going to be injustice or betrayal. So it's a very valuable thing for a healthy relationships.
Yes, so we're going to continue. The next thing that we need to cover is how to recognize your triggers, right? Now we've said, okay, you need to find your triggers. You need to start thinking and asking yourself questions about triggers and things like that. Our next step is how to recognize your triggers. So
Yes.
the first thing that you need to do is you need to pay attention. We call it, some people call it mindfulness. You need to be mindful not only of what other people are doing to trigger your anger, but also you need to pay attention to what you are doing, how you are responding, why you are responding this way. So you need to notice your body's response when you're angry. Does your heart rate increase? Does your muscles tense up? Do you clench your jaw or your fists? You become red in the face, like that emoji we spoke about yesterday. These physical changes can indicate that you're feeling angry, and you may need to find help to identify your triggers, especially if you sort of lose it. Some people will say, I just black out or I see red. In those moments, maybe you'll have to find someone to help you through those steps. You need to reflect on your past experiences. We have this friend, Tannie Deline Gibbons, and she said something once to me that was absolutely brilliant. She said, no, there's no such thing as new pain. There's only old pain. And so we need to reflect on our past experiences, because our past experiences will help us understand the pattern in which we react, but it will also help us to understand why we are reacting in this way. If you think about the times that you felt angry in the past, what is happening? Who was involved? What were the circumstances in which I got angry? Identifying those patterns in your past experiences can help you recognize your triggers in the future. Okay. Another thing, I always suggest this to clients, to do a journal. Journaling is amazing, and you don't have to physically sit and do journals. You can create a WhatsApp group for yourself where you type quick things for yourself, or you can do voice notes, you can do audio logs, you can do video logs. There are so many things that encapsulate journaling, but writing down or putting in print or getting out whatever it is that you are thinking or that you are feeling can help you identify your patterns and your triggers, because you can actually physically go back and see, oh, I've actually done this a few times. So take notes of what led up to your feelings of anger, how you responded, how you felt afterwards, And all of these things can help you to better understand your triggers and develop strategies to manage your anger. And then seek feedback from others. Anger is not in a vacuum, right? It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in relationships, at work, at home, family. So ask trusted friends and family members if they notice any patterns in your behavior when you're angry. Now, it's very important. You open this door, don't get angry when they give you answers. Okay, we need to take in, and sometimes it is difficult to hear these things, but have an open mind and allow people to help you see the patterns that you don't see. And they might be able to provide you with some insights and observations that you weren't considering before. Okay, so becoming more aware of your physical and emotional responses, reflecting on past experiences, keeping a journal, and seeking feedback from others, you can begin to recognize your anger triggers and develop strategies of managing your anger. Elzaan, you are going to tell us a bit more about recognizing the root of your triggers.
Yes, so it's important to understand that step one is recognizing what your trigger is. But once you've identified what your trigger is, we want to know, where does it come from? Because I often explain to my clients, it's like a wound. If you cut your hand and someone sticks their finger in that cut, you're going to react. But if there's no cut on your hand and someone touches your hand, even hard with your finger, you're not going to react because there's no hurt that you're reacting from. So it doesn't just help identifying the triggers and now just want to avoid my triggers. That's not how we resolve this. We want to know, what is the root of that trigger? Where does the hurt lie, so that we can deal with that? And most of our triggers actually come from our childhood. So childhood experiences can significantly shape one's behaviors and attitudes toward anger. And children often model their parents' behavior and communication styles. And that's what I explained yesterday, is that children have no idea about the world, about conflict management and interpersonal relationships and emotions. They learn from being babies. They learn by watching their parents. And so what a parent's behavior and communication style is going to shape what that child does, even as an adult. And you know what? I can see that I've got so many people in my life and clients where I can see even the children that judged the parents because my dad or my mom had anger issues and, you know, they didn't treat us right and there was injustice. And by that never being resolved, that child grows up and is an angry parent. That child grows up acting and behaving and communicating in the same way as the parent that they judged. So often that's where we learn how to communicate our anger. So if a parent struggled with anger management, the child may also struggle with managing their anger even as an adult. So that's the first thing. There's often pain in the childhood. Another root of your anger trigger could be environmental. So if you're living in a very high stress environment, let's take the example of a loud and violent neighborhood, for example. This can lead to a heightened sense of aggression or reactivity. So now people grow up in different neighborhoods, and some neighborhoods where there's a lot of violence, that could be where you've learned this. But I want to take another example. You know, I come out of the corporate world, and there was a lot of targets and pressure and deadlines and month end. And, you know, people get worked up very quickly. And so that would also be an environmental trigger where you are in a high stress environment. Another question that you need to ask yourself when we talk about triggers, and it actually goes back to childhood, is how you were raised. Was an anger outburst acceptable in your household? The way you were raised and the cultural norms surrounding anger can also impact your trigger. So if anger was considered acceptable or even encouraged in your household or in your community, you may struggle to manage your anger as an adult. How our parents or caregivers responded to our own emotions can also affect our triggers. So what I would like to say here is that there was this saying when we were little, is children are seen and not heard, you know. Just be in the corner, play, behave yourself. And, children weren't taught how to express their emotions, how to process their emotions, and often children's emotions weren't validated. Let's take an example of a kid crying. The first thing a parent wants to do is just get this child to stop crying. And so instead of working through why you're crying, what are you feeling, let's talk about this, let's pray about this, instead of educating the child, let's distract you. Look at this thing. Oh, it's pretty. Just stop crying. And so we teach children that you just need to suppress and ignore whatever you're feeling. Just move on, go on. The show must go on. And that's one of the ways that we actually are mistrained in managing our emotions. Did you want to say something about that?
Yes, it's very interesting because we see that there's a steep incline in kids with ADD and ADHD. And that's the reason for this. Whenever they're stressed, emotional, overwhelmed, they distract themselves. They avoid the conflict because that's what they were taught as infants between the age of 0 and 2. Oh, look at this. Or this is making a noise. Just stop crying. And sorry, I know it's speaking about anger, but and these ADHD kids are quite angry kids. These kids, I just wanted to bring the two together. It's because they were taught to avoid everything and suppress everything. And that's why they often struggle also with anger. They get angry at themselves because they're trying and trying and trying, and they're just not getting there. And it's not good enough. And actually, to find the root of that, you have to go back to infancy.
Oh, wow, that's so interesting. Another thing that I know ADHD is related to is actually brain inflammation. And if we think of stress and suppressing of emotions and the effect that that has on the stressed brain and your body's gut and all of that, that's where the inflammation comes from. So yeah, but let's not get off on a whole other topic. The way we were disciplined as children can also impact our triggers. So if there was harsh and inconsistent discipline, it causes trauma, and that leads to a greater likelihood of struggling with anger issues as an adult. And then if we've experienced abuse in past relationships, it can cause emotional pain and trauma that can trigger anger in future relationships. So that's what I really identified with, is the abuse that I experienced in past relationships. And that really, to an extent, had such a huge effect on my current relationships until I started dealing with the triggers and addressing the pain behind it. So lack of emotional education or support can make it challenging to identify and manage emotions. And I think this is such an important thing to note, is that we're so worried about having clever children, children that have a good IQ, but there's not a lot of input that's placed into children with regards to a good EQ. So how do I build emotional intelligence? Unresolved pain, such as grief, heartbreak, can trigger feelings of anger. So again, going back, getting counseling, getting help, releasing the trauma from the body, that can really bring a huge relief in terms of the triggers. And then trauma can cause emotional distress and hypersensitivity, and this leads to an increased risk of being triggered. So those are just a few of the ways that you can recognize the root, the hurt, what's behind this trigger. Okay, so let's quickly talk about managing our triggers, because managing triggers and anger can be a very challenging process, but it is possible to learn effective strategies to help you respond in a healthy way. So firstly, we need to understand anger. That's what we did in the first podcast, right? Understanding anger. So understanding the nature of anger can help you identify when you are experiencing it and how to manage it. Okay, the second thing, when we talk about managing our triggers, it's called normalizing anger as a feeling, but choosing not to act on it. So what we do is we're just so quick to respond out of our anger, and that brings the shame, and then we feel shame at feeling anger. So we need to understand that anger is a normal emotion. We don't have to feel shame for the anger. We just have to take control of the anger and not allow the anger to control us. So recognizing that it is a normal feeling, but that you have the power to choose how to respond to the anger, not losing control. I always say to my clients, scripture is so clear about it. God does not give you a spirit of control. You are not there to control situations and other people. God gives you a spirit of self control. So you are empowered through the Holy Spirit to take control. The moment you lose control, you're not acting as a righteous person. Another way to manage your triggers is to release your anger assertively. And that's got to do with assertive communication, because what we've got is unhealthy forms of communication when we are angry. But assertive communication involves expressing your feelings in a direct, respectful way without attacking or blaming the other person. And whenever I sit with couples, that's a big thing. So when we get angry, we get personal, and I want to hurt you back because actually I am hurt. And instead of getting personal and attacking you as a person and blaming you and using phrases like, you always do this, or you never do that, or, taking old arguments that should have been resolved and bringing it up again, all of that is not assertive communication. Assertive communication is, this is how I'm feeling. This is what you did or said to make me feel this way. And this is what you need to do in order for me to feel this has been resolved. So it is very important to look at how to communicate assertively. Another way to deal with your triggers or to manage them is understanding your triggers, because then you can actually anticipate situations that may lead to anger. And beforehand, you can work on a strategy. So if someone accuses me falsely, how am I going to act or react in that moment? If I feel unsafe, how am I going to manage that situation? So you need to identify the triggers and then decide up front, if this happens, how am I going to respond? Have a game plan ready. Another thing is to develop problem-solving skills. So when you identify the underlying issues that cause the anger, you can start working on, okay, how do I resolve this? Know when to let something go. Oh my goodness, this is a big one. Sometimes you just have to not go into the conflict. You need to have the wisdom to keep quiet sometimes, to not just address every single issue that's an issue for you, because then you're also going to be in a constant state of conflict. So sometimes you need to know, this is worth picking a fight over. This is worth being assertive over. And this isn't worth it. I'll just let it slide. But people that struggle with anger issues, because there's this thing about injustice, I just want to fight about everything and I don't know when to let go. And sometimes there is conflict that takes place, and you also need to know in that conflict when to let it go, when to say, okay, this is resolved now. I'm not gonna keep on going on and on and on and on, because that's a trigger for other people. So you are now when to let go of something. Avoid suppressing your anger. I think we've spoken about this quite a lot. Keeping it in is unhealthy. It leads to a lot of health issues. And because of that anger frequency being stuck inside of you, you're more prone to then reacting anger in upcoming circumstances. So it's very important to find a healthy outlet, like exercising or journaling or talking to a friend. So expressing the anger, but in a healthy way. Talking openly and clearly to prevent misunderstandings, because that's a big thing. Once we both upset, you say something, I say something, and we both hear something totally different. So make sure that we're talking and communicating in an open and a clear way. Another way is active listening. You get a lot of people that as you are in a conflict or an argument, they're not listening to what you are saying. They're just already preparing their response. And that's not a healthy way of effective communication. So active listening involves truly hearing what the other person is saying, putting yourself in that person's shoes, and then responding in a respectful way. The same way that you get offended when someone is disrespectful, the people that you're dealing with also get offended when you are disrespectful. So treating someone the way you would want to be treated. Another way is empathy. So practicing empathy, and empathy is, I can put myself in your shoes. I can see where you're coming from. I can see your point of view, and communicating that as well. Working on mutual trust bonding. So mutual trust bonding and respect in your relationships can actually help prevent conflicts and reduce anger triggers. So if you are in a relationship where there's no trust, that's definitely going to be a trigger for anger. So when there are not anger situations around, in the times of peace, build on that trust bond. So build that trust. Fighting fair, and I think we actually covered that in the previous 2 or 3 lines back. But not personally attacking a person, focusing on the issue. Because the moment we get angry, we become personal. But it's not the person. There's an issue. Let's talk about the issue and keep the person out of it. Exercise. Exercise is a great way to release pent-up emotions and stress. If you go to the doctor and you've got stress, even depression or anxiety, one of the things that doctors will tell you to do is to exercise. And I'm not saying go to the gym and become a bodybuilder. 30 minutes of mild exercise is enough just to release some of the cortisol and adrenaline that's built up in the body that actually contributes to anger. Deep relaxation practices such as deep breathing. And I think we'll do a podcast on that at some stage. But breathing is a great way to manage your stressors and to also manage your triggers. So when you feel I am getting upset, I've got a breathing app on my phone that I use. I'll sit with my app and I'll just do 3 or 4 minutes of deep breathing exercises because it switches off the stress brain and it switches on your logical brain. And it's the stress brain that reacts out of that fight, flight, or freeze. I want to tear you apart now because I'm not feeling safe. This is my coping mechanism. So you're reacting out of, it's just a reaction. You're actually not thinking. So if you could switch that off and switch your logical brain on, it's easier for you to calm down, identify what triggered me now. How do I communicate this in an assertive and respectful way? So then you can go through the motions. So breathing is a big, big thing. Sleep. So if we're not getting enough sleep, it becomes more difficult for us to practice good emotional regulation. And the last thing is that you need to take back control. Like I said, anger is usually a response where once you fall into that trap of reacting out of the anger, it's like you just on autopilot. You're like a machine gun and you're just firing off. But if you can take back the control, if you can identify the trigger, know what the root is, and manage it correctly, then you're back in control of the anger. So I think we're going to stop here today. And then we'll see you guys in episode 3. Thank you so much for joining us.
Please feel free to leave a comment. If you like this video, click the like button. Remember to subscribe to our channel and don't forget to ring the bell.